I don't believe in the supernatural. But just the same, I wouldn't live in Shawley Rectory. That was what I'd been thinking and what Gordon Scott said to me when we heard we were to have a new rector at St. Mary's. Our wives gave us quizzical looks. Not very logical, said Eleanor, my wife. What I mean is, said Gordon, that however certain you might be that ghosts don't exist, if you lived in a place that was reputedly haunted, you wouldn't be able to help wondering every time you heard a stair creak. Or the normal sounds of an old house would take on a different significance. I agreed with him. It wouldn't be very pleasant feeling uneasy every time one was alone in one's own home at night. Personally, said Patsy Scott, I've always believed there are no ghosts in the rectory that a good central heating system wouldn't get rid of. We laughed at that, but Eleanor said, You can't just dismiss it like that. The Cobworths heard and felt things, even if they didn't actually see anything. And so did the Bucklands before them. And you won't find anyone more level-headed than Kate Cobworth. Patsy shrugged. The Loys didn't even hear or feel anything. They'd heard the stories, but absolutely nothing happened while they were there. Well, maybe the Church of England or whoever's responsible will install central heating for this new person, I said, and we'll see if your theory's right, Patsy. Eleanor and I went home after that. We went on foot because our house is only about 1/4 of a mile up Shawley Lane. On the way we stopped in front of the rectory, which is about 100 yards along. We stood and looked over the gate. The date of the rectory is around 1760, and it's built of pale, dun-coloured brick with plain classical windows and a front door in the middle with a pediment over it. The house is a bit stark to look at, a bit forbidding. It seems to stare straight back at you. But the trees round it are pretty enough, and so are the stables on the left-hand side. Who exactly does it belong to? Said Eleanor. Lazarus College, Oxford, I said. Tom was a fellow of Lazarus. And what about this new man? I don't know, I said. I think all that system of living has changed, but I'm pretty vague about it. I'm not a churchgoer, not religious at all, really. Perhaps that was why I hadn't got to know the Cobworths all that well. Eleanor and Kate were close friends, and Eleanor missed her after Tom died suddenly of a heart attack, and she had had to leave the rectory. She'd gone back to her people up north, taking her 15-year-old daughter Louise with her. When Tom got the living of Shawley, Kate several times met Mrs. Buckland, the wife of the retiring incumbent, and from her learned to expect what Mrs. Buckland called manifestations. I couldn't believe she was actually saying it, Kate had said to Eleanor. I thought I was dreaming, and then I thought she was mad. Ghosts, I ask you. And then we moved in, and I heard them too. The crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive when there was no carriage or any kind of vehicle to be seen. Doors closing softly when no doors had been left open. Footsteps crossing the landing and going downstairs, crossing the hall, then the front door opening softly and closing softly. But how could you bear it? Eleanor said. Weren't you afraid? Weren't you terrified? We got used to it. You can get used to anything, to ghosts as much as to damp and woodworm and dry rot. There's all that in the rectory too, and I found it much more trying. The Bucklands, apparently, had got used to it too. Nobody ever seems to see anything, I said to Eleanor as we walked home. And no one ever comes up with a story. Is there supposed to be a murder there, or some sort of violent death? She said she didn't know. Kate had never said. The sound of the wheels, the closing of the doors, always took place at about 9 in the evening, followed by the footsteps and the opening and closing of the front door. After that, there was silence. And it hadn't happened every evening by any means. The only other thing was that Kate had never cared to use the big drawing room in the evenings. Once, she had had to go in there at 10:30. She ran into the room and ran out again. She hadn't looked about her. The icy hostility in that room had really frightened her, and that had been the only time she had felt dislike and fear of Shawley Rectory. I didn't have much faith in Kate's feelings about the drawing room. Jack and Diana Loy, that elderly couple who had rented the rectory for a year after Kate's departure, used that drawing room constantly. The Loys had been gone 3 months. When Lazarus had first offered the rectory for rent, the idea had been that Shawley should do without a clergyman of its own. But on the departure of the Loys, it was decided there should be an incumbent to replace Tom. The first hint of this we had from local gossip. Next, the facts appeared in our monthly news sheet, the Shawley Post. Shawley residents all extend a hearty welcome to their new rector, the Reverend Stephen Golton, whose coming to the parish with his charming wife will fill a long-felt need. "He's very young," said Eleanor. "Under 30, and they say his wife's only 23. They're moving in next month, and her mother's coming with them." Move in they did, and out again 2 days later. The first we knew that something had gone very wrong for the Goltons was when I was out for my usual evening walk with our Irish setter, Liam. We were coming back past the cottage that belongs to Charlie Lawrence, who is by way of being Shawley's squire, and which he keeps for the occupation of his gardener when he's lucky enough to have a gardener. At that time, last June, he hadn't had a gardener for at least 6 months, and the cottage should have been empty. As I approached, however, I saw a woman's face, young, fair, very pretty at one of the upstairs windows. I rounded the hedge and Liam began an insane barking, for just inside the cottage gate, on the drive, peering in under the hood of an aged Wolseley, was a tall young man wearing a tweed sports jacket over one of those black top things the clergy wear, and a clerical collar. I told Eleanor. She couldn't account for it. But Patsy Scott could. She came round on the following morning. "They've been driven out by the ghosts," she said. "Can you credit it? They were in that place not 48 hours before they were screaming to Charlie Lawrence to find them somewhere else to go." I asked her if she was sure it wasn't just the damp and the dry rot. "I'm telling you what Mrs. Golton told me. She came to us on Thursday morning and said, did I think there was anyone in Shawley had a house or a cottage to rent because they couldn't stick the rectory another night. They'd been terrified out of their lives by what they'd heard and seen since they moved in." "Seen?" I said. "She actually claims to have seen something." She said her mother saw something in the drawing room the first evening they were there. They'd already heard the carriage wheels and the doors closing and the footsteps and all that. The second evening no one dared go in the drawing room. They heard all the sounds again, and Mrs. Granger, that's the mother, heard voices in the drawing room, and it was then they decided they couldn't stand it, they'd have to get out. "I don't believe it," I said. "She's playing some sort of ghastly joke." "Just as Kate was and the Bucklands," said Eleanor, quietly. "What does Gordon say?" I said. "He's keeping an open mind, but he says he'd like to spend an evening there," said Patsy. The Haunting of Shawley Rectory got quite a lot of publicity. Stephen Golton's mother-in-law went on television. I hadn't ever seen Mrs. Granger in the flesh, and her youthful appearance rather surprised me. The interviewer asked her what had happened. "We were planning on going to bed early," said Mrs. Granger. "Just about 10:30 I had to go into the drawing room. I didn't put the light on, the moon was quite bright that night, and it was shining into the room. There were people, 2 figures, I don't know what to call them, between the windows. One of them, the girl, was lying huddled on the floor. The other figure, an older woman, was bending over her. She stood up when I opened the door and looked at me. I knew I wasn't seeing real people. I don't know how, but I knew that. I remember I couldn't move my hand to switch the light on. I was frozen, just staring at that pale, tragic face while it stared back at me. I did manage at last to back out and close the door, and I got back to my daughter and my son-in-law in the kitchen, and I collapsed. It was the most terrifying experience of my life." Now, the interesting thing was that there had been something in the Sunday Express account about the rectory being haunted by the ghosts of 2 women. The story quoted someone it described as a local antiquarian, a man named Joseph Lamb, whom I'd heard of but never met. "I never heard any of that before," I said to Gordon Scott. "Who is this Joseph Lamb?" "He's a nice chap," said Gordon, "and he's supposed to know more of local history than anyone else around. I'll ask him over and you can come and meet him if you like." The Scotts asked him and his wife to dinner shortly after Mrs. Granger's appearance on television, and after dinner we got him onto the subject of the hauntings. Lamb wasn't at all unwilling to enlighten us. He's a man of about 60, and he said he first heard the story of the 2 women from his nurse when he was a little boy. "Not a very suitable subject with which to regale a 7-year-old, he said. These two are supposed to have lived at the rectory at one time. The story is that the mother had a lover or a man friend or whatever, and the daughter took him away from her. When the daughter confessed it, the mother killed her in a jealous rage. It was Eleanor who objected to this. But surely if they lived in the rectory, they must have been the wife and daughter of a rector. I don't really see how in those circumstances the mother could have had a lover or the daughter could steal him away. No, it doesn't much sound like what we've come to think of as the domestic life of the English country parson, does it? Said Lamb. And the strange thing is, I haven't been able to find any trace of these women in the rectory's history. It's not hard to research, you see, because only the rectors of Shawley had ever lived there until the lawyers rented it, and the rectors' names are all up on that plaque in the church from 1380 onwards. My nanny used to say that the elder lady hadn't got a husband. He'd presumably died. She was supposed to be 40 years old, and the girl 19. Well, I found a good many cases where the rectors had predeceased their wives, but none of them fitted my nanny's story. They were either too old, one was much too young, or their daughters were too old, or they had no daughters. At this point, Gordon repeated his wish to spend an evening in the rectory. Soon we heard that the rectory was to be sold. The estate agents handling the sale were a firm called Curlew, Pond and Company. Gordon managed to get the key from Graham Curlew, whom he knew quite well, and permission to spend an evening in the rectory. He asked me if I'd go with him. Patsy wouldn't. She thought it was all too adolescent and stupid. The day on which we decided to have our vigil happened also to be the one on which Stephen Golton and his wife moved out of Charlie Lawrence's cottage and left Shawley for good. Patsy shrieked with laughter to see the two of us setting forth with our oil stove, a dozen candles, 2 torches, and half a bottle of Courvoisier. We crossed the lane and opened the rectory gate and went up the gravel drive on which those spirit wheels had so often been heard to crunch. It was 7 o'clock in the evening and still light. The day had been fine, and the sky was red with the aftermath of a spectacular sunset. I unlocked the front door, and in we went. The first thing I did was put a match to one of the candles, because it wasn't at all light inside. We walked down the passage to the kitchens, I carrying the candle, and Gordon shining one of the torches across the walls. The place smelt damp, and there was even fungus growing in patches on the kitchen walls. There was a kind of deathly chill in the air, far more of a chill than one would have expected on a warm day in October. We put our stuff down on a kitchen table someone had left behind and entered the drawing room. It was empty, palely lit by the evening light from 2 windows. We had decided not to remain in this room, but to open the door and look in at 10:30. So accordingly we returned to the kitchen, fetched out candles and torches and brandy, and settled down in the morning room, which was at the front of the house, on the other side of the front door. Curlew had told Gordon there were a couple of deck chairs in this room. We found them resting against the wall and we put them up. We lit our oil stove and a second candle, and we set one candle on the windowsill and one on the floor between us. The dark closed in fairly rapidly, the red fading from the sky, which became a deep blue, then indigo. The silence was absolute. We waited, watching the candles and the glow of the stove, which had taken some of the chill from the air. Outside it was pitch dark. The hands of our watches slowly approached 9. At 3 minutes to 9, we heard the noise. Not wheels or doors closing or a tread on the stairs, but a faint, dainty, pattering sound. It was very faint. It was very distant. It was on the ground floor. It was as if made by something less than human, lighter than that, tiptoeing. I didn't look at Gordon. I couldn't. I couldn't move either. The pattering feet were less faint now, were coming closer. I felt myself go white, the blood all drawn in from the surface of my skin, as I was gripped by that awful primitive terror that has nothing to do with reason or with knowing what you believe in and what you don't. Gordon got to his feet and stood there looking at the door. And then I couldn't stand it any more. I jumped up and threw open the door, holding the candle aloft, and looked into a pair of brilliant golden-green eyes staring steadily back at me about a foot from the ground. "My God," said Gordon. "My God, it's Lawrence's cat. It must have got in through the window." He bent down and picked up the cat, a soft, stout, marmalade-coloured creature. I felt sick at the anticlimax. The time was exactly 9 o'clock. With the cat draped over his arm, Gordon went back into the morning room and I followed him. We didn't sit down. We stood waiting for the wheels and the closing of the doors. Nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. At 9:15 we sat down in our deck chairs. The cat lay on the floor beside the oil stove and went to sleep. We stayed till 10:30, and for half an hour after that. And then we decamped. We put the cat over the wall into Lawrence's grounds and went back to Gordon's house, where Patsy awaited us, smiling cynically. I had had quite enough of the rectory, but that wasn't true of Gordon. He said it was well known that the phenomena didn't take place every night. We had simply struck an off night, and he was going back on his own. He did, too, half a dozen times. But in all those visits, he never saw or heard anything, and the effect on him was to make him as great a sceptic as Patsy. "I've a good mind to make an offer for the rectory myself," he said. "It's a fine house, and I've got quite attached to it. I'll go to the auction with a view for buying it if I can get Patsy to agree." But Patsy preferred her own house, and very reluctantly, Gordon had to give up the idea. The rectory was sold to an American woman. About a month after the sale, the builders moved in. The central heating engineers came too, much to Patsy's satisfaction. We met Carol Marcus, the rectory's new owner, when we were asked round to the hall for drinks one Sunday morning. She was staying there with the Lawrences until such time as the improvements and decorations to the rectory were complete. We were introduced to a very pretty, well-dressed woman in young middle age. I asked her when she expected to move in. April, she hoped, as soon as the builders had finished the 2 extra bathrooms. She had heard rumours that the rectory was supposed to be haunted, and these had amused her very much. A haunted house in the English countryside. It was too good to be true. "It's all nonsense, you know," said Gordon, who had joined us. And he went on to tell her of his own experiences in the house during October, or his non-experiences, I should say. "Well, for goodness' sake, I didn't believe it," she said. And she laughed, and went on to say how much she loved the house and wanted to make it a real home for her children to come to. She had 3, she said, all in their teens, 2 boys away at school, and a girl a bit older. There was a man friend of hers there, too. I didn't catch his surname, but she called him Guy. He was staying at one of the locals, to be near her, presumably. "I should think those 2 would get married, wouldn't you?" said Eleanor on the way home. "Judy told me she's waiting to get her divorce." Later that day I took Liam for a walk along Shawley Lane, and when I came to the rectory I found the gate open. So I walked up the gravel drive and looked through the drawing-room window at the new wood-block floor and ivory-painted walls and radiators. The place was swiftly being transformed. It was no longer sinister or grim. I whistled for Liam and strolled down to the gate and looked back at the rectory. It stared back at me. Is it hindsight that makes me say this? Or did I really feel it then? I think I did feel it. That the house stared at me with a kind of steady insolence. Carol Marcus moved in 3 weeks ago, on a sunny day in the middle of April. 2 nights later, just before 11, there came a sustained ringing at Gordon's door, as if someone were leaning on the bell. Gordon went to the door. Carol Marcus stood outside, absolutely calm, but deathly white. She said to him, "May I use your phone, please? Mine isn't in yet, and I have to call the police." I just shot my daughter." She took a step forward and crumpled in a heap on the threshold. Gordon picked her up and carried her into the house, and Patsy gave her brandy, and then he went across the road to the rectory. There were lights on all over the house. The front door was open, and light was streaming out onto the drive and the little Citroën Diane that was parked there. He walked into the house. The drawing-room door was open, and he walked in there and saw a young girl lying on the carpet between the windows. She was dead. There was blood from a bullet wound on the front of the dress, and on a low round table lay the small automatic that Carol Marcus had used. In the meantime, Patsy had been the unwilling listener to her confession. Carol Marcus told her that the girl, who was 19, had unexpectedly driven down from London, arriving at the rectory at 9 o'clock. She had had a drink and something to eat, and then she had something to tell her mother. That was why she'd come down. While in London, she was seeing a lot of the man called Guy, and now they found they were in love with each other. She knew it would hurt her mother, but she wanted to tell her at once. She wanted to be honest about it. Carol Marcus told Patsy she felt nothing. No shock, no hatred or resentment, no jealousy. It was as if she were impelled by some external force to do what she did. Take the gun she always kept with her from a drawer in the writing desk and kill her daughter. At this point, Gordon came back and they phoned the police. Within a quarter of an hour, the police were at the house. They arrested Carol Marcus and took her away, and now she is on remand, awaiting trial on a charge of murder. So what is the explanation of all this? Eleanor said, "It's as if all this time the coming event cast its shadow before it." I nodded, yet it didn't seem quite that to me. It was more that the rectory was waiting for the right people to come along, the people who would fit its still unplayed scenario. The woman of 40, the daughter of 19, the lover. And only to those who approximated these characters could it show shadows and whispers of the drama. The closer the approximation, the clearer the sounds and signs. The Loys were old and childless, so they saw nothing. Nor did Gordon and I, we were of the wrong sex. But the Bucklands, who had a daughter, heard and felt things. And so did Kate, though she was too old for the tragic leading role and her adolescent girl too young for the victim. The Goltons had been nearly right. Had Mrs. Granger once hoped the young rector would marry her before he showed his preference for her daughter? But the women had been a few years too senior for the parts. Even so, they had come closer to participation than those before them. All this is very fanciful, and I haven't mentioned a word of it to Gordon and Patsy. They wouldn't listen if I did. They persist in seeing the events of 3 weeks ago as no more than a sordid murder, a crime of jealousy committed by someone whose mind was disturbed. But I haven't been able to keep from asking myself what would have happened if Gordon had bought the rectory when he talked of doing so. Patsy will be 40 this year. I don't think I've mentioned that she has a daughter by her first marriage who is away at the university and going on 19 now. A girl that they say is extravagantly fond of Gordon. He is talking once more of buying, since Carol Marcus, whatever may become of her, will hardly keep the place now. The play is played out. But need that mean there will never be a repeat performance?
The Haunting of Shawley Rectory by Ruth Rendell was read by Miles Jupp and produced by Jeremy Osborne. It was a Sweet Talk production for BBC Radio 4 Extra.